"Oh God, not again," whispered one of the operators at Oahu's Women's Air Raid Defense, or WARD. It was the early hours of March 4th, 1942, and the women stared at their screens in dismay. Unidentified long-range aircraft were approaching Pearl Harbor. Operators urgently dispatched warnings, and American fighters were scrambled. But radar malfunctions, coupled with deteriorating weather, left the interceptors blind. Radar officers stared helplessly at their scopes, knowing the enemy had slipped through the defensive perimeter. 2 Japanese flying boats advanced steadily, confident. It had been just a couple of months since the most devastating attack on a U.S. military base in history. They were not ready for another one. An infamous blow. It had been a day of infamy indeed. December 7th, 1941. The rising sun glared off the metallic bodies of Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, the first wave of 183 bombers and fighters slicing through the morning calm. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zoikaku, had slipped across 3,500 miles of ocean in complete radio silence. Leading them was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of this mad gamble. He was about to attempt the impossible, to cripple the United States Pacific Fleet before it could fire a shot. For Yamamoto, a Harvard-educated strategist, the stakes were painfully clear. Japan could never hope to compete with the industrial power of the U.S., but they might be able to shock them into a favorable negotiated peace if they delivered a strong enough blow. At 7:48 a.m., torpedoes ripped through the shallow harbor, cutting through water modified with wooden fins to make the impossible work. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, spitting fire and iron. Fighters strafed airfields, tearing into hangars and anti-aircraft positions with surgical precision. Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows airfields were shredded in minutes. American fighters and bombers were lined up wingtip to wingtip, a perfect spread for Japanese gunners. By the time the dust settled, 188 aircraft lay in ruins, another 159 damaged beyond hope. And then came Battleship Row. USS Arizona buckled under a cataclysmic blast, its forward magazine erupting with such fury that 1,177 souls were snuffed out in seconds. Nearby, USS Oklahoma lurched and rolled, hit by multiple torpedoes. She capsized, taking hundreds of sailors to the bottom. There were oil slicks and burning debris everywhere as sailors plunged into the water, desperate to escape the inferno. Despite the devastation they managed to inflict, the Japanese failed in one of their objectives. Some of the most critical targets, the oil depots, the repair yards, and the submarine docks, stood untouched. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, overseeing the operation, ordered the fleet back after just 2 waves, spooked by the threat of American counterstrikes. In Washington, the shock hit like a sledgehammer. Until that morning, America had clung to its isolationism, haunted by the trenches of World War I. The America First Committee, with Charles Lindbergh at the helm and nearly 1 million backers, had fought tooth and nail to keep the nation out of another foreign conflict. That vanished in hours. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the very next day. Save for one dissenting vote, the legislators declared war on Japan, hurling the United States headlong into the global storm. Across the Pacific, the Japanese High Command reviewed its handiwork with sober eyes. Yamamoto, despite the initial triumph, sensed the flaw. The Pacific Fleet wasn't broken, just bruised. In Tokyo's war rooms, analysts pored over reconnaissance photos, decoding transmissions that whispered of something unthinkable. The Americans were rebuilding, and they were doing it faster than anyone had imagined. USS West Virginia, presumed lost, was being refloated, its decks slick with blackened oil. USS California and Nevada were being raised from the mud and welded back together for war. Welders burned through the nights. Cranes heaved wreckage from the depths. Pearl Harbor wasn't a graveyard. It was a crucible. By January 1942, Japanese scouts returned with grim news. Several of the battleships they thought crippled were back in dry dock, being prepped for action. When Yamamoto received the reports, he slammed his fist on the table, enraged. His entire strategy hinged on crushing the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor before the U.S. even realized it was at war. The Japanese Empire pushed on, desperate to capitalize on its fleeting advantage. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, even the Aleutians in Alaska. But the writing was on the wall. A second strike was needed. Yamamoto's Shadow. Literally translated as Operation Strategy, Operation K Saksen emerged as a desperate yet carefully calculated response from the Japanese High Command to the unexpected resilience of American forces following Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had personally stressed the importance of knowing the enemy's strength, famously cautioning his officers, quote, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The Japanese schemed a wild mission aimed at assessing the true state of American repairs at Pearl Harbor, and if possible, end them all in one fell swoop. Beyond mere reconnaissance, the mission sought psychological damage, leveraging the paranoia gripping Hawaii's inhabitants by striking at the center of their ongoing recovery efforts. The main objective was the 1010 dock, a crucial repair facility named for its distinctive 1,010-foot length. Destroying it would crush the American Navy's ability to salvage and restore large battleships or carriers in the mid-Pacific, forcing them to send ships all the way back to California. But there was another opportunity here, one to hit the critical infrastructure and support facilities that survived the initial attack, the same assets that had allowed Americans to repair their losses so quickly. A successful strike would further demoralize the American defenders. Additionally, the Imperial Navy viewed Operation K as a perfect trial for their newest technological marvel, the Kawanishi H-8K-1 flying boat, known to Allied intelligence by the codename Emily. The Kawanishi H-8K was a remarkable aircraft designed explicitly for challenging long-range missions over vast stretches of ocean. At 92 feet long, 30 feet high, and boasting a massive wingspan of 124 feet, the Emily was the longest operational flying boat in the world. Its 4 powerful engines gave it remarkable agility for its size, achieving speeds approaching 290 miles per hour, a stunning feat for such a heavily armed craft. Equipped with 5 20mm Type 99 cannons and 5 7.7mm Type 92 machine guns, the H-8K was more than capable of defending itself against fighter attack. Its payload capacity was equally impressive, allowing it to carry either 4,400 pounds of bombs or 2 devastating 1,800-pound torpedoes. First taking flight in January 1941, the H-8K's initial test runs had already demonstrated exceptional performance and reliability, but it remained unproven in combat. Operation K would change that. Yamamoto had asked for 5 Kawanishi H-8Ks for this critical operation, but due to production and logistical constraints, only 2 aircraft were available for this critical mission. Japanese planners carefully timed the operation for March 4th, 1942, to coincide with a full moon to improve visibility during the approach. To maintain secrecy, both flying boats would undertake the ambitious and unprecedented 1,900-mile flight from the Marshall Islands completely without fighter escort, relying solely on the cover of darkness and the element of surprise. Their first stop was to be the isolated French frigate Shoals, a tiny atoll 310 miles from Oahu, where the pilots expected to rendezvous with submarine I-23 for a swift and vital refueling. Strict radio silence was imposed to avoid alerting American intelligence, a protocol so severe that when submarine I-23 suddenly ceased communication on February 14th, none within the Imperial Navy immediately grasped the seriousness of its disappearance, despite the submarine's fate remaining unknown. Lost somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the High Command refused to abort the mission. Into the storm. The pilots chosen for the K operation were not average flyers. They were both from the elite 801st Kokutai Fighter Squadron, an elite and fervent unit revered for its incredible skill, unwavering bravery, and deep devotion to the Emperor. On the morning of March 3rd, 1942, both pilots flew their flying boats from their forward base at Jaluit Atoll to Wacha Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Awaiting them were 8 carefully prepared 550-pound bombs, divided equally between their aircraft. Before departure, the 2 pilots took a moment of solemn reverence. Hashizume clasped a small amulet given to him by his family. Sasao, standing silently nearby, offered his own prayer, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, reflecting upon the dangerous flight ahead. With their rituals complete, they climbed aboard their Emilys and lifted off, bound first for the remote French frigate Shoals. Their every move was being closely monitored by U.S. Navy codebreakers and intelligence analysts. Stationed in Pearl Harbor, this group of officers, headed by Captain Joseph J. Rochefort, had decoded and intercepted some of the Japanese message traffic hours before any actual attack came. An urgent message was dispatched to naval authorities in Hawaii, outlining the approaching aircraft. However, military authorities in Oahu dismissed the alert as improbable and not enough to justify evacuations or a large response. With no reports of carriers in the area, the brass was convinced that such a long-range bombing mission was way beyond Japanese capabilities. As darkness enveloped the Pacific, Hashizume and Sasao pressed onward toward their refueling stop at French frigate Shoals, arriving after nightfall. Both aircraft touched down gracefully on the calm lagoon waters. As they refueled, the pilots wondered about I-23, the missing submarine that was supposed to meet with them, provide them with crucial last-minute intelligence, and help with the refueling. With no clues to be found, they immediately took off again, rapidly climbing to cruising altitude. Their next destination was Oahu, over 300 miles to the southeast. As they pierced into U.S. territorial waters, an unexpected hurdle took them by surprise. The moonlit skies, predicted to provide clear conditions, ideal for precision bombing, rapidly deteriorated as a dense bank of clouds and fog rolled in from the northeast. Visibility dropped alarmingly, compelling Hashizume and Sasao to rely entirely upon instrument navigation. Among the many support tasks I-23 was meant to perform, one of the most critical was to share the latest weather reports with the Japanese pilots, so they did not fly blindly into the storm. It was at precisely this moment that the Women's Air Raid Defense Radar Station on Oahu detected unfamiliar signals. Immediately, alarm bells rang, prompting the dispatch of Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats. The gathering storm played against the Americans as well. The heavy clouds and rain squalls rendered the defending aircraft virtually blind. Pilots strained their eyes in the darkness, scanning futilely through turbulent skies and thickening fog, unable to spot the incoming Japanese planes. By around 2 a.m., both Japanese aircraft finally crossed the invisible perimeter surrounding Oahu, completely undetected and unopposed. However, the turbulent weather robbed Hashizume and Sasao of their bearings. They strained desperately through their cockpit windows, seeking familiar coastal landmarks or lights, signaling the location of their primary target, Pearl Harbor, but saw nothing except a dark, indistinct landmass cloaked in shadow. Flying blind. Having lived through the devastating first strike on Pearl Harbor, U.S. personnel were haunted by visions of another potentially more catastrophic attack. Captain Joseph J. Rochefort, head of Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's code-breaking and intelligence hub at Pearl Harbor, had earlier warned that a renewed Japanese aerial assault was probable, intensifying tensions among air and naval defense units. Meanwhile, far above the turbulent Pacific waters, the Japanese pilots, Hashizume and Sasao, were fighting their own desperate battles against the unexpected weather conditions. Thick, swirling clouds enveloped their aircraft, cutting visibility down to mere meters. Hashizume strained to maintain visual contact with Sasao, their planned coordinated approach to Pearl Harbor rapidly unraveling. Hashizume, increasingly anxious, attempted to re-establish order. Breaking the strict protocol of radio silence, he urgently radioed Sasao, quote, "Fly northward towards Pearl Harbor." The transmission echoed hollowly in his cockpit, but no reply came. Concerned but determined, Hashizume radioed again, repeating his instructions louder and with palpable frustration. Still, only static returned. Whether due to the oppressive weather interfering with communications or a sudden malfunction of Sasao's radio equipment, the two aircraft had irrevocably drifted apart. Unbeknownst to Hashizume, Sasao, now isolated, decided to trust his instincts rather than gamble further communication attempts. In confusion, he turned his aircraft southward, convinced he would find a clearer path to his target. Thus, instead of striking in coordinated tandem, the two Japanese planes advanced toward Oahu from opposite directions, fragmented and uncertain. Below them, the island was mostly obscured by a deliberate government-imposed blackout to prevent targeting by enemy bombers. Civilians huddled anxiously in homes, with windows tightly shuttered, the radios issuing periodic warnings of potential air raids. For Hashizume and Sasao, the very measures meant to protect the populace had turned the island into an indistinct shadow beneath the clouds, leaving them with no visual landmarks, critical for a precise strike. Hashizume, his aircraft buffeted by gusts, finally glimpsed the faint outline of what he assumed to be Pearl Harbor's installations. His nerves frayed, he released his bombs hurriedly. 4 explosives plunged earthward, detonating harmlessly on the densely wooded slopes of Tantalus Peak, narrowly missing Roosevelt High School by less than half a mile. The explosions, though intense, did little more than gouge deep craters in the volcanic soil, leaving no casualties or significant damage, but awakening terrified residents who feared the onset of another devastating Japanese attack. On the island's opposite coast, Sasao found himself even more disoriented. Fuel running critically low, and without any idea what portion of Pearl Harbor lay below him, he reluctantly dropped his bombs into the ocean waters off Waianae's coastline. The bombs detonated harmlessly under giant waves, seen only by a few fishermen who noticed resplendent flashes that briefly lit the night sky. The pilots, suddenly very conscious of how vulnerable they were, started back to the Marshall Islands. Their raid, originally intended as a psychological and strategic blow to American resolve, had dissolved into a panicked escape. Misinformation. Sasao, running low on fuel and increasingly anxious from the confusion over his navigational errors and missed targets, was the first to reach safety. Exhausted and shaken by his failure, he landed his aircraft back at Wocha Atoll, the same remote base from which he had launched nearly 24 hours earlier. As ground crews hastily assisted him from his cockpit, he was somber and deeply troubled, already anticipating the disappointment awaiting him from senior command. His superiors expected a victory, but he brought back only excuses: bad weather, faulty communications, and poor visibility. Still, Sasao was fortunate. He had returned. Hashizume was not as lucky. His aircraft had sustained significant damage earlier, when, under pressure at French frigate shoals, he'd scraped the hull violently against coral reefs during takeoff, rupturing the aircraft's structural integrity. With seawater slowly seeping into the flying boat's compartments, he knew the damage was severe. Realizing he could not risk another open-sea landing without urgent repairs, Hashizume altered course for Jaluit Atoll, hundreds of miles further south. Flying low to conserve fuel, constantly monitoring gauges that flickered alarmingly, he finally managed a precarious landing at the atoll, just as the first rays of morning sunlight pierced the horizon. Hashizume's damaged aircraft, hastily patched together by mechanics working feverishly, soon received word of an astonishing report broadcast by an American radio station from Los Angeles. Inaccurately, but vividly, it announced that Pearl Harbor had again been attacked, sustaining heavy casualties. 30 soldiers lost and 70 more wounded. Though entirely false, the misinformation traveled rapidly, soon reaching jubilant ears in Tokyo. To the Japanese High Command, the account was a powerful morale boost, seeming confirmation that Operation K had succeeded. Emboldened by this misinterpretation, senior commanders quickly ordered another raid, determined to exploit this perceived advantage. As the triumphant veteran of the last successful raid, Lieutenant Hashizume was immediately tasked with leading the next assault. On March 10, 1942, just days after the failed raid on Oahu, he took to the skies once more. As he approached Midway Atoll, his aircraft, easily spotted by vigilant American sentries who were now fully alert to possible Japanese incursions, fell prey to a squadron of Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters. In the ensuing brief but ferocious aerial battle, Hashizume's flying boat was riddled with bullets, its heavy, battered frame trailing smoke and flame as it spiraled toward the Pacific Ocean. He did not survive the crash. His life was lost to a rumor and the results of his own previous failure. This was the end of Operation K, the bold but ultimately doomed Japanese attempt to strike Pearl Harbor a second time. It became forever known as the longest-distance bombing raid ever undertaken by 2 unescorted aircraft in military aviation history, and a reminder that the U.S. would only be fooled once.